Chapter 14.
Oh, Peacemaker!
Kinkaju's voice echoed through the air as Peacemaker almost jumped up into the air in surprise. Reaching out for the pot that held the strawberry plant, he stopped it from falling to the floor of the Nightwing greenhouse. Sighing in relief as he looked at his table of fruits, vegetables, and herbs, Peacemaker looked out of the door of the building and was greeted with the sight of a yellow and pink adult Rainwing stepping inside, her contagious grin on her face. Peacemaker could not help but smile at the Rainwing, who had been one of his caretakers since his hatching. While she could be loud, and could ask 100 questions per minute, Peacemaker loved her presence almost as much as he loved Moon's. For what reason she came to the Nightwing village was beyond Peacemaker, however. Wasn't she supposed to be helping Queen Glory with something?
Hello!
Kinkajou greeted him while wrapping her wings around him in an embrace.
It's so good to see you, Rainbow Wings!
As always, Kinkajou's nickname for him made Peacemaker laugh. Well, he had multicolored star membranes on his wings, but he'd hardly call them rainbows. But when Kinkajou set her mind on something, there was hardly much you could do to discourage her. So, he just let her call him Rainbow Wings, as it was a nice nickname. "Where have you been?" Peacemaker asked as he backed away from Kinkajou's hug and moved her over to a cushion to sit on while he went back to taking care of the fruits and vegetables. "I was hoping you'd be here when I got back home from school." While he did not remember the last few days of the term at Jade Mountain, which was strange, you would think he'd remember bidding Zwing farewell for the winter holidays, he remembered how Kinkajou had not visited him when he returned home to the rainforest. He had been disappointed. But now, here she was. The disappointment had all but dispersed.
Well, you know,
Kinkajou said as she sat down comfortably.
The Queen needed her best friend, which would be me, to deliver something special to Prosperity.
And how did that go? Did you see Moon and Kibbley?
Oh, it went perfectly,
Kinkajou answered.
I mean, I am the most reliable of the Queen's messengers.
Once again, that grin of Kinkajou's appeared.
As for Moon and Kibbley, you could say they,
Just as Kinkajou spoke, Peacemaker saw the Rainwing freeze in mid-sentence. Before he could ask if Kinkajou was feeling all right, Peacemaker noticed that the entire environment had turned a dark shade of gray, all the color draining from the world around him, except for his own scales. Yet, just as Peacemaker was about to panic about what was happening, he saw two dragons come through the entrance of the greenhouse. Rubbing his eyes, Peacemaker saw that, like himself, the colors of the dragon's scales were normal, rather than being enveloped in the gray aura. Upon closer inspection of the two dragons, Peacemaker recognized the Sea-Wing and Sky-Wing that entered the greenhouse. "Cliff? Tempest?" Peacemaker said, all the while feeling his eyelids grow heavy. What were they doing here? Shouldn't Cliff be home in the Sky Kingdom? And wasn't Tempest at home at Aderin? No. The last he'd seen both of them was in the common cave back at Jade Mountain, right when it was time for bed before they were to enter the dream world. Oh, he was dreaming. They hadn't entered the dream world yet. Peacemaker walked past the dream version of Kinkajou and made his way to his friends. The Rainwing hybrid glanced between Cliff and Tempest. He remembered how the two had been angry with each other after something he had done when they were awake. Cliff paid no mind to Tempest as he walked past the Sea-Wing and approached Peacemaker. His red eyes examined the greenhouse, the prince nodding as he looked almost impressed. "So, is it really like this?" Cliff asked. "Almost," Peacemaker replied, looking back at the greenhouse. "This is what it looked like before I left for the academy." Making sure that his growing spaces were filled with enough fruits and vegetables and prepared for the Nightwing village, Peacemaker wanted to make sure that way he still contributed to the village's food supply. When he returned home, he expected his work space would be much more vacant. "Wow, I like it," Cliff said, positioning himself so he could stand beside Peacemaker and nudge him in the shoulder. Peacemaker grinned at his friend's nudge. Tempest stepped forward, giving him a small smile.
Peacemaker, are you ready? She asked. Even though he remembered spending the rest of his time awake, mentally preparing himself for his journey into the dream realm, Peacemaker would be lying to himself if he said that he was not nervous about what would come. The only time he'd been to the dream world was when he had been dragged into it by whatever had had a hold of him during the quarter break. Even with Tempest and Cliff accompanying him, he was still apprehensive. Yet, after what he had nearly done to his friends mere hours before, Peacemaker was not willing to take chances. Ready or not, he was going. Yeah, Peacemaker nodded after collecting his thoughts. I'm ready. Stay close, Tempest replied, holding out her wings to both him and Cliff. Without hesitation, Peacemaker walked up to the Sea Wing and let her drape a wing over his shoulder. Despite the anger he showed towards Tempest, Cliff had approached her with little hesitation and let her drape a wing over him. Then, just like before, Peacemaker felt like his body had fallen into warm water. His surroundings vanished, becoming nothing but light around him. Despite not seeing much around him, he could feel as though his body was moving faster than a skywing in mid-flight. This sensation made him both excited and dizzy. Very dizzy. Cliff! Peacemaker heard Tempest's voice speak through the light. Do not let go! I can't! Was all that Peacemaker could hear from his friend. Cliff? Peacemaker called out to the Skywing Prince. What's wrong? Cliff muttered tiredly. Peacemaker felt Tempest shift beside him. Cliff! Next thing Peacemaker knew, he could no longer feel Tempest beside him, and he felt as though he were spinning in midair. Desperately trying to understand what was happening, Peacemaker reached out with his talons for anything to grab a hold of. Yet, all his talons could reach was empty space. Tempest! Cliff! Peacemaker called out desperately for his friends. Yet, there was no answer. However, Peacemaker knew one thing. His surroundings were slowing, and the surrounding light dimming. Then, he felt it. The feeling of his body hitting water, followed by a loud splash. All of Peacemaker's surroundings grew dark as his body no longer felt like it was spinning. Now, it felt like he was falling. Looking towards the sky, Peacemaker's eyes widened in shock. The skyline. It looked like the surface of water, as if one were to look up at the water's surface when completely submerged. Above the water, Peacemaker could see various lights that filled up the night sky, despite it seeming that he was underwater. He knew one thing. He was falling, with no signs of stopping. Looking down at the ground, Peacemaker saw a shadow-covered landmass, the ground rapidly approaching. Repositioning his body, Peacemaker attempted to open his wings to slow his descent. As his wings opened, he felt horror wash over his body when he realized something. He felt no wind under his wings. He was not stopping. Just as panic consumed him, Peacemaker felt talons grab a hold of his shoulder, causing his descent to slow. Looking up at what had grabbed him, he was greeted with the sight of Tempest. The glow around her scales had lessened, the glow appearing more like an outline rather than engulfing glow. Beside her was Cliff, who had a red outline around his body. Tempest held onto his arm as well. Whatever had happened, the Skywing Prince looked like he would be sick. Are you alright? Tempest asked. Yeah, Peacemaker answered, turning his gaze back to Cliff. What happened? I'm fine, Cliff murmured. I felt so dizzy. It can happen to anyone, Tempest explained. Some dragons tolerate the transition better than others. Wow, that's great to hear, Cliff groaned sarcastically. For the next few minutes, the three of them drifted towards the shadowed ground below them. As they drew closer to the ground, Peacemaker noticed that the specific area of the landmass they were heading towards appeared to be mountainous. Almost like the region of Jade Mountain. No, it was Jade Mountain. The three dragons eventually touched the ground, their talons touching the cliffside that looked almost like the southern entrance to the academy. Turning his gaze south, Peacemaker could see the forest valley that was a popular hunting ground for the students of the academy. In the trees, he could see the faint glows of light coming from somewhere within the branches, brightening up the shadowed environment where the reflection of the moons could not. Tempest walked up beside him, staring out at the horizon with him, followed by Cliff. "Welcome," Tempest began, "to the realm of dreams." "It almost feels like we're awake," Peacemaker said, looking over at Tempest. "Why does this place look like our world?" "Because it mirrors our own," Tempest said. "Dragons cross to this realm when we sleep, but few are aware of it while they dream." "Sounds complicated," Cliff muttered. His voice was still tired, but it sounded better. "It is," Tempest admitted, turning away from the direction they had been looking at, and made her way to the cave entrance. "But I can say this. Our answers will be here. We can find out what has been happening to Peacemaker with a clearer view of his dreams, rather than being inside them." "How so?" Peacemaker asked, as he and Cliff followed Tempest through the cave entrance. Despite having just arrived in the dream world, Peacemaker was glad that it at least resembled the real world. "Why couldn't we just go through my dreams?" "Because the dreams themselves are like a box," Tempest explained. "When a somnus enters another dragon's dreams, we can alter the dreams as we see fit, yes. But on a minor level, we do not see the entire picture by submerging ourselves into them. So, we need to be outside of the box, with a sky view." Peacemaker glanced at Cliff, wondering if he understood what Tempest was talking about. But the frown on his face confirmed that he was just as lost as Peacemaker was. All of this talk about boxes. If they were in the dream world, shouldn't they be in dreams or something? Peacemaker wanted to understand. When the three dragons walked to the halls of the dream version of the academy, Peacemaker and Cliff froze as a shadowed figure turned a corner and was walking straight towards the three dragons. "What the?" Cliff shouted until Tempest held up her talons towards him. "It's Clay," Tempest said immediately. "What?" Peacemaker asked, looking back to the shadowy figure who had the shape of Mudwing, with a limp. "The dream world is a reflection of our world. Inhabitants of this world can still see those who are awake, but not as clearly as when they are awake," Tempest explained just as Clay walked past them without even a glance. "To the inhabitants of this world, we are nothing but shadows when we are awake." Peacemaker continued to look at the retreating figure of the Academy's defense instructor. He was understanding, at least. They could see what was happening to those awake. But what about those who were sleeping? This question was answered as Tempest led Cliff and Peacemaker to what would be the Quartz Winglet's common cave. As they entered the familiar surroundings, Peacemaker saw the two dragons present in the center of the cave. But, unlike Clay, who had appeared as a shadowy figure, Peacemaker could fully see all the features of the two dragons that were sleeping in the middle of the cave. It was Hyena and Alligator. Both the Sandwing and Mudwing were curled up next to each other, their backs pressed against one another. Peacemaker recalled how he had last seen the two studying together before he had gone to sleep. It was strange to see Hyena, ever the energetic individual, seem so at peace beside Alligator. But it was nice to see. "Peacemaker, come on," came Tempest's voice. Looking back, he saw that she and Cliff were heading towards the sleeping cave he and Cliff shared with Jaguar. "Coming," Peacemaker said, trotting after the two quickly. Once he'd caught up with them, they had already entered the sleeping cave. Sure enough, there were three dragons with fully detailed shapes. Peacemaker, Cliff, he wondered if Cliff was as weirded out as he was seeing their sleeping forms, and Jaguar. "Well," Cliff coughed,
looking at his sleeping form. Said form had plopped onto his back. Had no idea that's what I looked like when I slept. Focus, please, Tempest muttered as she approached Peacemaker's body. Walking up beside her, Peacemaker glanced at his body. Despite feeling familiar with his own body and looking at reflections of himself in the mirror, looking at his own body from this perspective, he almost did not recognize himself. This created a conflict of emotions through Peacemaker. He knew he was a Rainwing-Nightwing hybrid, but he felt like he was looking at a different dragon. Almost like something was missing. Peacemaker was snapped out of his thoughts as Tempest suddenly spoke. "Show me Peacemaker's mind," Tempest said, her voice sounding very commanding. As he was about to ask her who she was talking to, Peacemaker felt his head grow warm. Turning his attention to his body, he noticed his eyebrows twerk. Then, in front of him, Tempest and Cliff, the three were greeted with a brilliant light that appeared before them, engulfing the surrounding cave. Through the light, Peacemaker saw images flash before the three of them. Images that were all too familiar to him, all showing experiences that Peacemaker vaguely recalled from his dragonethood. The sounds that accompanied these images made Peacemaker realize what he was looking at. He was looking at his memories.
Moon! Moon, 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 moon pies. Sleepy! Mommy made me get up so early.
At hearing these words, Peacemaker glanced back to see images of Moon. Some of these memories Peacemaker vaguely recalled, being among the earliest he could remember. Seeing Moon's smiling face in his memories made Peacemaker smile to himself, making him remember the times he was very young. "Wow," Cliff said, approaching him from the side. "I have to say, this is kinda cute." Peacemaker could not help but blush at the comments from Cliff. "I was little," Peacemaker said. "As were we all." Cliff chuckled as he turned his attention towards Tempest. Looking back, Peacemaker saw that Tempest was looking intently at a series of memories that flashed before her. Walking towards her, Peacemaker stood beside the Sea-Wing and stared up at the memories. But instead of seeing memories, all Peacemaker could see was darkness. "Peacemaker," Tempest asked, glancing at him, "what was the closest time you were to death before the Academy?" Blinking at the question, Peacemaker was taken aback by what she asked. "Oh, what?" Peacemaker asked, unsure of the purpose of the question or what the black images represented. "Where is this coming from?" Cliff asked Tempest suspiciously. Tempest glanced from Peacemaker to Cliff, and then back to Peacemaker. "These are memories," she said, gesturing to the darkened images. Looking at the images, Peacemaker felt his body grow cold the longer he looked into the darkness. Turning back to Tempest, he tried to take his mind off them. Peacemaker stuttered. "There was a time I was sick, back when I was little." "Anything else?" Tempest asked. "What caused the illness?" "The healers in the Nightwing and Rainwing villages didn't know," Peacemaker said, recalling the time when he was a year old. His head had throbbed, his chest hurt so much, and he could not hold down his food. Kinkajou and Moon had brought healers from both villages to help him try to recover. His caretakers told him that the healers had ruled every common illness out, stumping the most skilled healers. Peacemaker's mother was contacted while she was visiting the Mud Kingdom. The Queen wanted her to return to him because the illness showed no signs of lessening. The healers even suspected that Peacemaker would die. Yet, the day his mother returned home, the illness left as quickly as it had appeared. That was the only time he had been sick. Tempest paced in front of Peacemaker and Cliff after hearing his answer, deep in thought.
Cliff brushed his wings against Peacemaker's. So, there were a few memories that were blank, Cliff replied. What does this mean? Tempest's gaze shifted back to them. Where there was once curiosity was now concern. Because from what I have seen, the blank memories outnumber the memories that we can see, Tempest answered. Peacemaker stared at Tempest in disbelief. She had to be joking. Tempest turned towards the blank mirrors and said, Show us all of Peacemaker's memories. The environment around the three altered again. Now, they stood in a circular space. Thousands of images that represented Peacemaker's memories filled the area, all showing different parts of his life until now. At least, that's what Peacemaker was expecting to see. Of all the images he could see, Peacemaker was greeted with the sight of more blackened images than there were images that were filled with his own memories. Only a small fraction of his memories filled the area, while darkness engulfed most of the environment. Peacemaker felt his feet grow weak upon realizing how many memories that his mind could not recall. Whatever was affecting him, it was not just affecting his dreams and body, it was affecting his mind. Peacemaker looked aimlessly at the blank memories. Seeing all of this made Peacemaker feel empty. Yet, through one of these blank memories, Peacemaker heard a small voice among the memories.
This is my mother. Those are my moons. This is my world.
Peacemaker? Tempest's voice and a nudge from her wing snapped Peacemaker out of the trance the voice had caused in him. Looking at the sea wing, Peacemaker could see his friends giving him concerned looks. What is it? Didn't you hear that? Peacemaker asked. The voice sounded alien. And yet, it sounded familiar. But where had he heard it? Whatever he'd heard, Cliff and Tempest had not, as they gave him a confused look. I didn't hear anything, Cliff said, shaking his head. Nor did I, Tempest added. Frowning, Peacemaker looked at the blank memories again. Seeing all the memories that were blank only made him feel overwhelmed. Can you please make them go away? Peacemaker muttered to Tempest. Without hesitation, Tempest did as he asked, and commanded the images to vanish. After the images disappeared, and the sleeping cave was all that could be seen, Peacemaker sat on the ground, placing his head in his talons. Peacemaker felt empty inside. Okay, Tempest, I've had enough, Cliff said, frustrated. What is behind the blank memories? What is happening to him? Beside Peacemaker, he felt Tempest sit down, brushing her wing against his own. My father says that when memories are darkened, they exist in our mind, but something is blocking them out, Tempest explained. Looking up at her, Peacemaker saw the Sea Wing's green eyes look into his blue ones. When this happens, entities from the dream world can interact with these memories and alter them to their liking, even changing a dragon's personality. What causes memories to be darkened in the first place? Cliff asked, walking so he was in front of Peacemaker. Hearing Cliff sit down, Peacemaker looked up to see his friend giving him an assuring look. Where exactly is this entity? Multiple things, Tempest answered. Most commonly, illnesses that affect the mind. As for the entity, Tempest gestured at Peacemaker's sleeping body, the wards are still in place. I can confirm this. Yet, what we are dealing with is the damage the entity had already caused, but hasn't been repaired. Had this sickness when he was a dragonette affected his mind? It was likely. It had come out of nowhere and vanished as soon as it appeared. This entity had affected his mind enough to damage it. Even if it had been repelled, the damage it caused still existed. That explained something. Despite knowing the causes and how much it had affected his memories, now he questioned how much of his dragonettehood that he could not remember, did not make him feel any better. How do we undo the damage? Peacemaker muttered. How do I regain these memories? And how can I regain control of who I am? Not what this entity tried to turn me into. We repair the damage here, in the dream world, Tempest explained. Luckily, as a somnus, I can repair it. I just need to learn the right enchantments. I'm sorry. What? Cliff asked, raising a brow. Only animus dragons can make enchantments. In the physical world, they are, Tempest said, smirking at Cliff. But here in the dream world, somnus dragons are the animus dragons. Hearing this, Peacemaker felt the despair and fear he had felt prior disperse. He realized things could get better. He just needed to have faith in Tempest, as she was in her element. So, what's our first step? Peacemaker asked as he stood up with Tempest and Cliff. First thing, we need to find the place where the most recent memories are disrupted, Tempest revealed. If the illness is the cause, then we need to go to the Dreamworld's version of the rainforest, the equivalent of where you suffered from the illness. All right, Peacemaker said. He could not help but allow a hopeful smile to cross his lips. We can do that. Let's head there now, Cliff commented, walking towards the exit of the Dreamworld version of the sleeping cave. Sooner we can help Peacemaker, the better. Quickly following Cliff, Peacemaker and Tempest caught up with the Skywing as they exited the common cave. When you visited my dream, you said time runs slower in the dream world, correct? Cliff asked Tempest. At this, Tempest nodded. So, we should be able to help Peacemaker in one visit. Ideally, Tempest answered. But we... Suddenly, the Sea-Wing stopped. Looking back at their friend, Peacemaker and Cliff's eyes widened as the glow around Tempest grew faint. Looking back at Peacemaker and Cliff, Tempest's eyes suddenly grew tired. Tempest groaned. We need to go back. Tempest? What's wrong? Peacemaker asked. The sudden change in Tempest made him nervous. Go back where? No, time... Tempest groaned, suddenly running past Peacemaker and Cliff. Looking at Cliff, Peacemaker's eyes widened when he saw the red glow around his scales grow dim, just like Tempest's. Looking at his own talons, the blue glow around him was fading. Peacemaker did not know what this meant, but he knew that something was happening, and he was not sure he wanted to know. Peace, let's hurry, Cliff said, running after Tempest. Nodding, Peacemaker followed his friends. Drawing closer to Cliff and Tempest near the entrance to the dream version of the Academy, Peacemaker smashed straight into an invisible force. Falling to the ground by the impact with said force, he felt like he had just run into a stone wall. Groaning, Peacemaker looked up to see that Cliff and Tempest were on the other side of whatever was blocking the entrance. Cliff clawed at the invisible force viciously, while Tempest placed her talons on the field. Both tried to say something from their side of the field, but whatever was in between them was blocking the noise. You are going nowhere! Peacemaker's eyes widened as he heard a familiar whisper in the back of his mind. No, not in the back of his mind. Behind him! Spinning around, Peacemaker saw a shadowy figure of a tall dragon walk through the halls, making his way towards him. At first, he thought the shadowy figure was someone who was awake and was merely walking the halls of the Academy at night. But a closer inspection of the dragon made him realize the shadowy dragon was here, in the dream world, with him. The figure stared at Peacemaker with a pair of amber-colored eyes that radiated a malevolent glow. Instantly, Peacemaker recognized the eyes. They were the same pair of eyes that belonged to what was attempting to drag him into the dream world. The same individual Tempest had saved him from. Feeling his heart beat rapidly, Peacemaker spun back to the invisible barrier and attempted to claw at it with his talons. On the opposite side, he saw Tempest directly in front of him, placing her talons over the barrier. He saw her lips calmly move, repeating an unheard word repeatedly. Despite her appearing calmer than Cliff, he could see tears well up in her eyes as she looked into Peacemaker's. Peacemaker then felt the chill run down his spine. Turning around, Peacemaker's eyes widened in horror. The shadow-covered dragon was gone. In his place stood the walking corpse of an Icewing with a mortal injury in his stomach. "No," Peacemaker whispered, his voice quivering weakly as he felt his back press into the invisible barrier. "No!" The Icewing stared down at him with his dead eyes, just as his serrated talon swiped down towards Peacemaker. "Oof!" Peacemaker exclaimed as he felt the pair of talons yank him back to the ground. Looking behind him, Peacemaker saw Cliff and Tempest dragging him away from the academy entrance. "Go! You need to go!" A female voice Peacemaker did not recognize shouted from behind him. Peacemaker glanced back to see a new dragon running towards the edge of the cliff. Blinking, he saw that the dragon had gray scales, and, the most striking part of the dragon's figure, 2 pairs of wings, one pair larger than the other, with patterns that resembled a butterfly's wings. A pair of butterfly-like wings? A silk wing? Unlike Cliff, Tempest, and Peacemaker, who all had an aura around them, this dragon did not have any light glowing from her body. "Who are you?" Cliff yelled after the Silkwing as she left the 3. "No!" The roar from the nightmarish Icewing came from the academy entrance, who now bolted out of the academy entrance and onto the cliff with the dragons. "You will not leave!" Peacemaker looked back to the Icewing as it pounced toward him. "Repel!" Tempest shouted. The next thing Peacemaker knew, an invisible force smashed into the Icewing, knocking the Icewing further back a few feet. Peacemaker then saw Tempest step in front of him, wrapping a wing around her and Cliff, just as the Icewing recovered and rushed at them again. "Return!" were the last words Peacemaker heard from Tempest before everything around him turned white. His body rolled off of his sleeping platform with a loud thump. "Yeah!" Peacemaker shouted in fright as he opened his eyes and jumped up. "What the?" came the startled shout of Jaguar from across the cave. Ignoring Jaguar's surprise, Peacemaker, remembering everything that had occurred moments ago, stared toward where Cliff slept. Despite not falling off of his sleeping platform, Cliff's eyes were wide open with the same amount of shock and fright as Peacemaker's. "What's wrong?" Jaguar said, surprised at seeing Peacemaker on the floor. "Did you have a nightmare?" Taking a moment to regain his composure, not wanting to tell Jaguar what had transpired, that he, Cliff, and Tempest had been to the dream world, shook his head after he calmed. "No, I'm fine," Peacemaker said, calmly. "Just a vivid dream." Jaguar gave Peacemaker a skeptical look, before looking back at Cliff, who appeared calm. Despite visibly doubting what Peacemaker said, Jaguar at least did not pressure. "Well, you know to talk to us, right?" Jaguar asked, to which Peacemaker nodded with an appreciative smile. Though, underneath this smile, Peacemaker felt a combination of feelings. He did not want to lie to his clawmate about the excursion into the dream world, which, very well, almost culminated into a fatal encounter with the very entity that was affecting his mind. But he, and Cliff, and Tempest, agreed that it would be safest if only they went to the dream world. After the first visit, Peacemaker understood why. Satisfied with his nod, Jaguar slowly went back to sleep. Getting back onto his sleeping platform, Peacemaker shifted his body, so he laid curled up facing Cliff. From their respective sides of the sleeping cave, Peacemaker and Cliff's eyes stared into each other. Peacemaker wished he could talk with Cliff, like with telepathy, about what had happened. But he wanted to wait when it was just the two of them and Tempest. Hours passed, and sleep did not come to either Peacemaker or Cliff. When the sun had risen and the morning gong had rung, Peacemaker and Cliff were quick to get up before the others. Despite greeting their winglet, Peacemaker and Cliff waited outside of the cave patiently for Tempest. Once the Sea Wing had finally stepped out, Peacemaker and Cliff were about to bombard her with thousands of questions. Until they noticed that the Sea Wing's eyelids were dark and half-lidded, almost as though she had not slept. "Tempest?" Peacemaker asked quietly, as Hyena and Alligator walked out of the cave to go about their routines. Stepping towards her, he placed a wing over the Sea Wing. "What? What's wrong?" Tempest looked away from the two, rubbing her eyes with her talons. "Come on," she yawned. "Let's get to breakfast." With that, Tempest brushed past Peacemaker and Cliff, quickly walking down the halls of the academy, all the while swaying tiredly. Peacemaker looked at Cliff with concern. All the while, the Skywing Prince stared after her with curiosity. In silence, the two friends followed Tempest. "What happened?" Cliff asked as he passed Tempest with some fish. "The Icewing and Silkwing? What was all that?" "I don't understand about the Silkwing," Tempest replied as she cut off a piece of fish and ate it. "All I know is that her presence in the dream world differs from ours." Sitting from across Tempest, Peacemaker watched the Sea Wing eagerly eat her breakfast. The dark circles around her eyes had largely disappeared, but Tempest still appeared exhausted. It seemed, by eating and explaining, she at least forgot she was tired. "What do you mean, differs from ours?" Peacemaker asked. Tempest looked up from her food towards Peacemaker. "The aura of light we had around us?" Tempest asked, to which both Peacemaker and Cliff nodded. "It represents our protection while traversing in the dream world. How long our minds can handle being away from our bodies." Tempest paused for a moment, frowning as she went into deep thought. "Before mind rot kicks in." "Mind rot?" Peacemaker asked, hesitantly. "A term one of my ancestors coined," Tempest muttered. "It's a term that describes how a somnus can enter the dream world, but the longer they stay away from their body, the greater the strain our mind will endure." "That's what you meant by wanting to do things quickly," Cliff realized. "Back when you entered my dream, you were not concerned about us wasting time before dawn." "I was concerned about how long my mind could handle the strain," Tempest responded, nodding. "If I stayed in the dream world for too long, then it would be difficult for me to return to my body." For a moment, Tempest stopped to look at both Cliff and Peacemaker, her gaze filled with guilt. "Then I could not get you both back to the waking world." Upon hearing this, Peacemaker realized just how closely the three of them had reached the point of no return. During their first venture into the dream world, they had come close to not being able to return to their bodies. "So, what now?" Peacemaker asked, reaching out his talons to touch her own. Tempest slowly wrapped her talons around his own. Looking up at him, Peacemaker saw her lips curve into a smile. "First, we go about the rest of our day. I'll ready myself for our next venture into the dream world," Tempest explained. "Then we travel to the rainforest of the dream world, and we figure out how to restore the memories." Realizing that Tempest had not given up on him, Peacemaker smiled back at her. She was still willing to help. He was nervous, especially after what had happened. Yet knowing Tempest would still help him gave him some confidence. Confidence that things would go back to normal.